Welcome back to the Engage in Truth broadcast. This is Steve Ford, your co-host, along with Pastor John Bornschein, Senior Pastor at Calvary Fellowship Fountain Valley, located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Thank you for joining us again today. Last episode, as you'll recall, we left off in Daniel chapter 6, with Daniel just having been retrieved miraculously unharmed from the lion's den. As Pastor John mentioned, when we have bold faith, we must understand that whether we live or die, we do all things to the glory of God. Romans 14:7-8 says, "For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's." Now remember, Isaiah believed God and was sawn in two. Paul believed God and was beheaded. Peter believed in God and he was crucified upside down. There have been martyrs throughout all the history of the church. The issue is that we accept God's will, trusting that he is going to work his glorious, perfect will through us and around us. We must have faith. Remember 1 John 4:4, "You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world." So let's open our Bibles and see what God has to teach us today as we finish our journey through Daniel chapter 6. Now remember, you can find prior episodes of this series, along with prior episodes of this broadcast, archived on the church's website at calvaryfountain.com. That's calvaryfountain.com. And here's Pastor John to get us started.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ford. It has been a lot of fun going back to studies that perhaps you're familiar with from Vacation Bible School and things that just jog a memory of, oh yeah, Daniel in the lion's den. But when we really go through it verse by verse, it brings a sense of joy, a fresh remembrance, if you will, to go back and see how God delivered a faithful servant and did so in such an amazing way that we're still talking about it all these years later. And we found out in Daniel chapter 6, verses 21 to 22, that an angel of the Lord had shut all of the lions' mouths. So we're talking about many lions. One angel did the job, didn't need a whole legion of angels, right? Just one. And we found out, of course, as we go back to 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37, that one angel was able to defend all of Jerusalem, even slaying 185,000 Assyrians. Yeah, so one angel was more than enough to be able to protect Daniel there in the lion's den. And as Darius is desperate to try to find a way to save Daniel, cognizant of the horrible error that he had made in his pride, he runs to try to find out if indeed Daniel's God has saved him. It seemed that Darius demonstrated a faith beyond what many Christians even demonstrate, because he knew that Daniel's God would save him, and so much so that he runs to see the results for himself. And Daniel responds out of the lion's den, "O king, live forever." He has a respect for the king whose ego and pride had led to him being there in the first place. Yep. He didn't respond with some kind of, arrogant, disrespectful, "Yeah, I'm fine, no thanks to you." No, he understands the gravity of the situation, that God had delivered, God had done this, and in so doing, he is now being positioned once again in a favorable role before an administrator, before the king himself, that will go well with Daniel to be able to intercede on behalf of the people, right? Daniel has constantly been positioned by God to defend Israel. And we know that Ezekiel was down with the people, right? And Daniel's in this administrative wing, constantly purposed by God to be a voice for God to whomever is going to be in this leadership role. And so Daniel will have had to sustain, ultimately throughout his journey, it will be 7 different administrative leadership kings and roles of various administrators who will come and go. And we know how with Darius and Cyrus, it's like a dual kingship. And so Daniel's right there, once again, positioned by God. So let's kick off once again, Dr. Ford, with verse 23. We just hit it last week. Let's come back to it. Sometimes we need a refresher before we continue our journey.
It says, "Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he believed in his God. In verse 24, and the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Well, now, some say that the lions didn't eat Daniel because, well, they just weren't hungry. So when Daniel was cast in, they're just, in between meals or something like that. But come on, many of us have seen videos of how lions and tigers will usually maul a stranger in their area, even if they don't consume them, right? They still maul them. Mm-hmm. So Daniel would have died without the Lord's intervention. It's so blatantly obvious. These lions were clearly hungry. They were ferocious, and they shredded these people before they even hit the ground.
That's right. The law of the Medes and Persians said, on account of the guilt of one, all of his kindred must perish. Okay, so that's the law that we still even have today, right? So they have found incredible records through the Persian Empire and the archaeological dig sites and, all these discoveries that just keep coming out. It's an incredible collection. So that was the law, and they executed that law on the whole family. It wasn't just an act of retaliation, some kind of lex talionis. It was on the whole family. I mean, this had to be carried out to make a public demonstration of those who were in disobedience. It was impacting their whole family. And I think of sin a lot like that, right? Sin impacts our whole family. Our children will be impacted by the sin of the fathers. It just carries on. Now, granted, we read in Ezekiel that every man must stand on their own decisions before the Lord. However, we do know that the impact of our decision making is going to impact even generations not yet born. And we see that clearly here, that they would take it out on the whole family. Here's what we read on verses 25 to 27. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? Now God used one man in his 80s to impact an entire kingdom. Okay, so don't ever think that God can't use you. Now, the whole Medo-Persian Empire is under the decree to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Since Persian rule would dictate that the monarchs were under their own decrees, that means that any king that follows would likewise be under the jurisdiction of that law. Therefore, all of the Middle East is under this decree. Are you catching this? That from this day forward, the Medo-Persian Empire held the entire Middle East. That means that they are still under this decree unless anyone else has changed that law. And to my recollection from all archaeological discoveries, this has never been changed. That means that Yahweh rules, not Allah, not any other fallen god, fake god, demonically inspired. Even if you recall, as we go through Daniel, you'll find out about this Prince of Persia, the Prince of Greece, and so forth. These are demonic spirits that are moving in the hearts of these kings to do their bidding. And here is now the ruler of the Middle East is declaring Yahweh rules. It was declared by Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4 and Darius in Daniel chapter 6. Cyrus will make a similar declaration in Ezra chapter 1. So it doesn't matter if we call this region Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. One could argue that the people are still under these decrees, along with the whole world under the system of Babylon, according to Revelation chapter 17 all the way to chapter 19. So let's ponder that for a moment. Listen to verse 28. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So you see here that Cyrus is now mentioned And when we go to Daniel chapter 10, we will talk more about him. So there are some amazing prophecies that I'll show you on how Isaiah tells of Cyrus. We just dabbled in it a little bit, but his role as king, as he will even serve God in bringing about the end of Israel's captivity, the establishment of Jerusalem once again, to rebuild it, to rebuild the temple, to set the captives free. All of this was declared by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 44 to 45, and that was 150 years before the man was even born. Okay, you get what I'm laying down here? That God has decreed this, that a man who he gives the name of and a kingdom's name that neither of them even existed when the prophecy was given, of exactly what he would do and when he would do it 150 years beforehand. So I believe that if you see one thread through the tapestry of the book of Daniel, it is not the exaltation of Daniel, it's the majesty of God, who stands against the nations of the world and upholds his sovereignty. So, Dr. Ford, I think it's now appropriate for us in our time to actually move into chapter 7. We can actually start to move into chapter 7 here. And it's so vital that we pick up each of these pieces along the way. I think it'd be so easy to miss the power of what Daniel chapter 6 reveals to us, of what Darius declared, what Darius believed, as he sees Yahweh in the work of Daniel's life. The man who rules over the entire Middle East, declaring Yahweh is Lord and ruler. And yet what we find in Daniel 6 is our mind just gravitates right away to the lion's den. And rightfully so. We need to do that, but we need to see the much bigger picture here. So now imagine being Daniel or the Apostle John as they receive visions of the future. I mean, kingdoms that were to come that did not exist even at the time of the vision. I mean, it's humbling to consider the magnitude of it all. And often the Lord would give the prophet a vision of something that was closer in time so that the prophet could be validated as a spokesperson for God and trusted when revealing events that would not be witnessed in their time. I mean, well beyond their time. Otherwise, false prophets would be put to death, right? So they had to be trusted. So something had to happen in the short term that would validate them and confirm them as a prophet of God. And then they could simultaneously speak of things that they would never see in their lifetime, but they knew it could be trusted. Because otherwise, in fact, Deuteronomy 13, 5-10 describes how people were to stone false prophets for trying to lead them astray. And that whole chapter is called the punishment for apostates. So when it comes to prophecy, we also see sequences of similarities. So God will reveal an event that's to come in the near future and then reveal that will happen again in a similar but different way in a distant future. So we're going to talk about those as we get into these final 6 chapters of Daniel. This is critical to understand. He's going to give us these images like Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He's going to give us an image of him and what he does as a symbol of what the Antichrist of the final Shemitah cycle, final 7 years, will do likewise. So we get these glimpses of, as you saw it happen here, it will happen again. So this is to serve as both a warning to the generations and to reveal the signs to those who are looking for them. And as I mentioned when we first began this study in Daniel chapter 1, there are over 8,362 predictive verses in the Bible, or an estimated 2,500 prophecies. And there is no other book in the world that has stated so much about the future and been 100% right on every single occurrence. 416 prophecies had specific timetables involved, and every one of them came to pass as stated. There are approximately 500 prophecies still to be fulfilled in the end of days with the coming kingdom of Jesus Christ. And we know that they're going to happen exactly as foretold. God reigns, and there is no other. He has declared his will from the beginning, according to Isaiah 45, verses 14-25. Now listen, if you go to the Colorado Press Association network, you will find a section called Public Notices. And from what I had gathered, there were 7,917 public notices that were written and displayed there. That is what God has done with his word from the very beginning. Romans 1 tells us that It's always been told and on display for the whole world to know there is no excuse. In fact, listen to what the Lord says in Isaiah 46, 9-10. He says, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. So as we look here to Daniel 7, we're going to shift gears from the history of events to the prophecy of kingdoms. There's a sequence of kingdoms in chronological order that move toward the glorious kingdom of Jesus Christ. Here's what we read in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. So you see here right away that Daniel 7 was taking place before Daniel chapter 5. Okay, here's where we're getting the issue. So Daniel 5, we were introduced to Belshazzar, son of Nabonidus, who was a co-regent of Babylon. It was his last year as king in 539 BC, the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But Daniel 7 takes us back 10 years before that, meaning Daniel was about 70 years old when this vision is given to him by God. And we'll get back to the chronology sequence not until Daniel chapter 9. So you're probably naturally asking, why does he jump out of chronological order? And that's a great question. Well, the first 6 chapters build on the history that will ultimately lead to the captives returning to Israel. Now, Daniel is grouping the visions together. And this is by God's design. Daniel didn't just sit down and contemplate all this. This is what God does. It's his word after all. And they give us more details on the sequence of the kingdoms and events that ultimately lead to the first and second coming of Jesus Christ, because really that's what it's all about, Jesus and his people. So the world revolves around Jesus and around his work with his people. That's right. You matter to Jesus. This is all about his kingdom, and his kingdom has to be filled with his people. He is the groom and we are the bride, and he is planning and setting all things in motion. He's gone to prepare a place for us. Everything revolves around his planning. So the enemy wants you to think that he rules this world and you're somehow an intruder in his plans. But the truth is that Satan and his agents of evil and all his kingdoms are going to burn. He's the one to be evicted, not you. You belong to Jesus. This is all about his story after all, and about what he's doing to bring you into a kingdom that's eternal. So even after death, or even after the rapture, we will be coming back with Jesus on white horses, according to Revelation 19:14. So we've still got work to do down here during the millennial kingdom of Christ. So the whole story revolves around Jesus and his people. So Dr. Ford, could you take us into verses 2-3?
Yeah, here we go. So Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So here the vision is given to Daniel, and not to a king for Daniel to interpret. He sees 4 winds of heaven stirring up a great sea. So let's start by assessing the winds. Now, the number 4 comes up quite a bit in the scriptures, especially when we see how God addresses the places of the earth. The expanse of all the nations is called the 4 corners in Isaiah and in Ezekiel. I find it interesting that the Bible calls attention to the 4 corners of the sheet that is presented to Peter in Acts 10 when he was being moved by God to give the gospel to the Gentiles in Acts 10:28. There are also 4 corners and 4 winds on the earth described in Revelation 7:1. When we read in Matthew and Mark, we see the following. This is Matthew 24:31. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And Mark 13:27, and then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven.
Amen. So there's a great stirring up by the hand of God on earth. Now, what is God stirring up? He's stirring up the great sea, is what it says here. So Daniel was still in the heart of Babylon at this point, and the Bible tends to reference four major bodies of water: the Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, and the Sea of Galilee. I mean, after all, everything seems to revolve around what's going on in Israel, right? Israel's the epicenter of all of this, and it's generally a reference to the seas that are all taking place or exist in and around Israel. So the Mediterranean was often called or referred to as the Great Sea. But I don't think we should just assume that that is what Daniel has in view here, because the sea often represents the Gentile nations. We see that in Revelation 13, verse 1, while the land often symbolizes Israel, or the place inside of the original borders given to Israel. And you've got to keep in mind, it is much bigger than the land of Israel is today. It's from the Euphrates River down to the Nile River. That's the true borders that were given to Israel in Genesis chapter 15, Exodus 23, Numbers 34, and even in Revelation 17, we read this starting in verse 15, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So I believe the best way to interpret the opening to this vision is that God is moving in the nations of the earth and shaking them up to fulfill his purposes. Now listen, when I was a kid, I would collect bugs. I know. I had a tarantula, a couple of scorpions, even a horned lizard. I even had an ant farm. Okay, my mom loved all this, by the way. You can only imagine, poor mom. Well, one of my friends came over and grabbed my ant farm and shook it like crazy. I mean, those poor ants, the whole world just changed in seconds, right? You imagine this kid just comes over and just shaking my ant farm. It was just another day of moving dirt, and then all of a sudden, everything just starts flying everywhere. You imagine one of these little ants. Well, sometimes I feel like God is doing this with the kingdoms of men, just shaking things up, and their precious little AI algorithms can't predict what God is going to do next. You see here, verse 3, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. Now, in just our brief time, let me just highlight a couple things for you here. So out of this troubled sea arises 4 superpower empires. And we're going to see that in Daniel 7, verse 17, that appear as beasts crawling on the earth. Again, this is the building on the vision that was given to Nebuchadnezzar of the image of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and iron mixed with clay. So keep in mind that a common interpretation tactic of hermeneutics is to evaluate Daniel 7 in a similar way as Daniel 2, which is an outline of kingdoms that rise and fall in sequential order. But it doesn't mean that Daniel 7 is written in the same way. These may be kingdoms that rise and fall in sequence, or it may be a list of kingdoms that exist simultaneously or in various time periods. So the bottom line is that prophecy must be handled with care, and we cannot jump to conclusions. So as we go through this, I'll give you the predominant perspective of the interpretation. Then I'm going to share with you in brief some perspectives that perhaps are held by the minority view, and I think you'll see that they have some merit. And these kingdoms have a spirit about them, which we can say is their identity as God sees them. After all, God looks at the heart of man, and we see that in 1 Samuel 16:7. He assesses kingdoms in the same way, looking at the heart of the people. And we see how God curses entire cities like Bethsaida or Chorazim or Capernaum in Matthew chapter 11, verses 20 to 25. And Paul called some of the people of Ephesus beasts in 1 Corinthians 15:32. They weren't literal beasts, but they behaved like it. It was a spirit about these people. So Dr. Ford will come back to verse 4 next week, and we'll continue in our study of Daniel chapter 7. I hope you're just as excited to go through prophecy and to study the book of Daniel as we are. And if you'd like to listen to this broadcast and others in the series, go to calvaryfountain.com, and there you'll see a little drop down for audio, and you can share this podcast even with your friends and family alike. We hope you've been blessed by this study, and if you'd like to join us on Sunday, you can find us Calvary Fellowship, Fountain Valley Church at calvaryfountain.com, and services are 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on Sundays. We'd love to see you there. God bless you, my friends. Take care.